Hello everybody, here we are, we're talking about APUSH. My name is Mr. Lagerway, I'm joining you from West Michigan, and we are here to talk about some APUSH Unit 3, let's go! Here we are, glad to see the chat is already popping, just to make sure that everything is working alright, and that we're doing things well. Why don't we hit some stuff, see the chat's already working, but just to make sure you can hear me, you can see me, the slides are working. Tell me, who has been your favorite character from APUSH so far? Hi Sam, good to see you. So let's see if we can put this in the chat. Who's been your favorite APUSH character so far? This could be a person, this could be a hero, it could be some interesting stuff going on. Could be your favorite person to study because you like them, could be your favorite person to study because you hate them and you really want to rage against them. But yes, as Tabitha is mentioning in the chat, we need to make sure that we are hydrating today. I'm enjoying some lovely iced tea. So we got some votes for Thomas Jefferson. We're talking about him today. This is fantastic. We got some votes for W.E.B. Du Bois, George Washington, Millard Fillmore, the obscure presidents. All right, nice job. Here we go. The Grimke sisters. Boss, yes. Not only are they fighting for women's rights, they're fighting against slavery. Oh, does it get any better? Ida B. Wells, near and dear to my heart. Got this close to letting my wife name my daughter after Ida B. Wells. Maybe the next time. Henry Clay, Ben Franklin, we got some good people. All right, so that appears that we're doing all right. The chat is popping. You can hear me. We got some APUSH knowledge going on. You folks are knowing all the good peoples. Maybe they're people to study. Maybe they're people to emulate, but at least you got some people in mind. This is great. Let's keep going. A couple of reminders. Remember, your name appears in the chat, and that may be part of the recording, so if you want your name to appear as something else, go ahead and change that now before we get too far into this. Might be a good idea. Also remember, follow Fiveable on all kinds of social media. That would be a good way to keep abreast of what's going on here. Make sure you don't miss some of these streams. And then, just to tell you, we're in the middle of our Unit 4 review this week, and then we got other ones coming up. Please, please do pay attention to the fact that, although most of these are Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, of course, some of these are going to be a little bit different. So we have 2 of them for you in 2 weeks. We're going to have one on March 30 and on April 1. That's a Tuesday and a Thursday. Awesome. We split the ginormous Unit 7 into 2 parts. Make sure you're aware of that. And then we get a little bit later, we have April 13 and 15, a Tuesday and a Thursday. Note the change in time as well. So there we go. Plus more coming up. We're going to get you covered. Just a reminder, the way this is working out is we're going to have unit reviews for each of the units, and then we're doing some deep dives into the exam. We have an exam tips and tricks, and then also FRQs, so covering all of your writing. So if you're like, oh man, I could use some writing help, hey, we're here for you for that. Then, what are we doing tonight? Well, we got some frequently asked questions from the Fiveable Discord, the forum that you folks have been talking about. Absolutely. We got ourselves Period 4 content review. We're going to go over that. We got some practice questions, some practice documents. We got some study tips, and we got some question and answer time, and that should work throughout. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the question and answer session now, so that way, if you'd like to access it, and or upvote some questions that you have. Maybe we can get to those by the time we're done. If not, our amazing TA, Thomasina, who is helping to moderate the chat, she might be able to answer some of those in the Discord later. She's awesome. She's very, very helpful. Let's dive in. Enough of the preliminaries. Let's get into this. All right. So, some people have asked, hey, how can I rely on the provided historical sources, the stimuli from the stimulus-based and multiple choice questions, or do I have to apply my own historical knowledge to answer multiple choice questions? The answer, like most good history questions, is, well, it depends. It's kind of both. It depends on the question, right? I'm actually going to give you, because of this question, I added some multiple choice questions that are going to have some stimuli that you have to read, some that are like, and some that are, you can just answer this based on historical knowledge. The nice thing about the stimuli is that they're not usually trying to trick you, but it's always a good idea to read them anyway, and if you know that you know your history really well, that really helps and can set you up to read the stimuli correctly. Couple of other options here. Another question was, how can I memorize vocabulary, the acts, the compromises, the treaties for each period? This is APUSH. There is a lot of minutia. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of small little details. Well, my advice is always be selective. Don't worry about memorizing everything, right? You got to work your way down from big to small. So start off by saying, all right, we're in the middle of Period 4. And that's what we're doing tonight. And as Thomasina has already been sharing in the chat, it's 1800 to 1848. Okay, so that's like Thomas Jefferson, Seneca Falls Convention, and some stuff is happening in the middle with maybe Jefferson, Jackson, Democracy. I don't know, something like that. And then I go, wait a minute, okay, so now I need to think about Jackson. What do I remember about Jackson? Then you talk about the bank, or you talk about the tariffs, or Indian removal, right? So work your way from the big stuff down to the small stuff, that's what you need to be working on. And then lastly, someone was asking, how can I identify change in continuity over time for each period? Great question, frequently used in the middle of an APUSH exam. And my advice to you would be, let's think about themes and major dates. So maybe you memorize some dates. We'll discuss this more in the exam tips and tricks, of course. Maybe you've memorized some important dates and you know those, and that can sort of anchor you a little bit. You could talk about major themes. So talk about what's happening with politics during this time, what's happening with society. You can always check in with various groups that are frequently talked about in AP US history. So like, what's happening with African Americans right now? How are they fighting for their freedom? What's happening with women? How are they fighting for equal rights? What's happening with the military and engagement with other countries? What's happening with the frontier? What's happening with engagement with Native Americans? You get the idea, right? Congress, president, economy, what's happening with the national culture. Do that and then start working your way down and see what you can do with more specifics. So hopefully that addresses some of the questions that you folks have been having more frequently in the Discord. As always, the Discord is always open, and we have that immediately after this stream. Thomasina is moderating a nice discussion with you folks where we can answer some of the questions that we didn't quite get to today, or some follow-up questions that you may have. So be sure to check that out. Oh yeah, and of course, follow at Think5able for more tips and tricks, because that's awesome. So let's get into Unit 4. Brief overview of Unit 4, what we're going to talk about. We got democracy and parties, economy, and migration and culture. Notice I said move from the big to the small, right? That's what we're doing tonight. We're moving from the big topics to the small topics. Don't lose the forest because of the trees, right? So we're talking 1800 to 1848, and then all of these changes that happen along the way. So let's dig in. First, we got this guy, the old Thomas Jefferson. We call this the age of Jefferson at the beginning somewhat. It's one way to label it anyway, in a way that I guess says that Jefferson was very important. And he was. He takes office in 1801 in the Revolution of 1800. That's the election. Is it really a revolution? Well, it is the first peaceful transfer of power in U.S. history between political parties. Remember, George Washington allegedly doesn't have a political party. John Adams is the next president. He's a Democratic Republican. And then we have Jefferson, John Adams is a Federalist, excuse me. Jefferson is the Democratic Republican. Thus, we have the transition between political parties. Once Jefferson gets in office, he tends to govern a little bit different than he campaigned. Sounds like every politician ever, am I right? But a lot of this has to do with practicality, right? So Jefferson becomes president. He starts off by doing a whole bunch of stuff like the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. That's a little bit of stretching the Constitution. That's one thing I would be aware of, as well as the United States doubling in size is kind of a big deal. We got the War of 1812. There are a couple things you should know with the War of 1812, right? As we get closer and closer to the War of 1812, we should be aware of the things that lead to that, things like the Embargo Act, things like Macon's Bill No. 2, the Non-Intercourse Act, all those kind of fun things. Talk about those. And then at the end, you got the Hartford Convention. A lot of cranky Federalists in New England are saying, hey, we didn't want to go to war with England. We kind of like England. Plus, trading embargoes really hurt us because we're trading. And thus we're going to have problems with New England trying to secede, the Hartford Convention. And remember, this is the part where there's like well, John Green calls them 1812 problems, where we don't have internet, we don't have really, really fast stuff. So, communication. So the Federalists are going to send their complaints down to D.C. D.C. gets the complaints in this order. They get, well, first of all, they get news. The United States has signed a Treaty of Ghent. The war's over. Fantastic. Secondly, they get news of Andrew Jackson's amazing victory over the British in New Orleans. Then they get the notice that a bunch of whiny Federalists are like, we don't want this war. Well, the War of 1812 is over. It kind of looks like we won this like special bonus PS battle, and now you're complaining and threatening to secede? Ah, geez, that's ridiculous. So this really turns people off to the Federalists, who gradually are going to fade from view and become less and less important on the United States political stage from this time onward. So we should be aware of all those things that kind of lead to the War of 1812, much like I have a student that I always tell them, I'm like, I'm sorry, this is not AP military history, as much as some of us would enjoy that. But remember, with wars, it's more about what leads to it and what are the effects, maybe a reason about like why we won or didn't win or something like that. But in this case, what leads to the War of 1812, tensions between France and Britain and us, and then the Hartford Convention is going to be after or toward the very, very end of the war. We're also going to have to be aware of the so-called era of good feelings. Remember, the Federalists fade from view. Then we get Presidents Madison during the War of 1812 and Monroe. So it's not just Jefferson. He's gone from office in 1809, right? So these guys are going to come in, and basically there's going to be only the Democratic Republicans, no Federalists, but even the Democratic Republicans don't agree on stuff, and they're going to start disagreeing about a whole bunch of different items that we should be aware of, and we'll get to that in a later slide. We should also be aware that the Supreme Court starts to flex its muscles, especially that good-looking guy right there. Tell me who that is in the chat as we continue to talk about this a little bit more. A reminder that the Supreme Court has to kind of create its own identity during the early republic, right? The founders kind of made it as an afterthought. It was kind of the weakest of the branches, and Congress and the president are duking it out initially, but then the Supreme Court starts to become a thing and really comes into its own in the early 1800s. So, it's led by this guy who was appointed by John Adams as one of the midnight judges at the very end. And yes, PN has it correct. It is John Marshall. Sam, nice job. A lot of people are saying John Marshall. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, this is John Marshall, appointed by John Adams, which means he is a Federalist judge, which means even though the Federalist Party is declining nationwide, John Marshall is able to, I guess you would say, carry on a lot of the Federalist legacy deep into the 1800s. So, couple examples. And again, don't worry about memorizing all of these. Just be able to talk about a couple of these and then recognize them if they come along. Probably the most important is Marbury v. Madison. This is the one that establishes judicial review. John Adams, through a little bit of judicial jujitsu, don't say that 10 times fast, oh boy, he ends up making it so that the Supreme Court can review laws, declare them unconstitutional, and yet also doesn't tick off the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson enough that they sort of ignore him and then make the Supreme Court utterly powerless. So, yeah, that was Marbury v. Madison. It was all about an appointment of Mr. Marbury himself and the midnight judges. You can get into the details of that later. For our purposes, the big deal is judicial review. There's a couple other ones, like Fletcher v. Peck, that talks about, hey, judicial review can happen even of state laws. So it's not just federal laws the Supreme Court can oversee, it's also going to be state laws. Remember, the Supreme Court, or the judicial branch as a whole, is in charge of interpreting the laws, overseeing them, making sure that they are constitutional. We're also going to see other ones like McCulloch v. Maryland. This is the famous case that affirms the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution, meaning the federal government is supreme to the states. Again, this just kind of has to do with federalism a little bit and makes sure that the states cannot interfere with the federal government, especially when it comes to interstate commerce and things like that. And then lastly, we got it. Well, and loose construction. I should mention that too. Sorry. This is the idea again that the Constitution is a little bit more stretchy, perhaps a little bit loose. It's not like the federal government can only do what the federal government is allowed to do in the Constitution explicitly. They can also do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out their duties. This means that they can do a couple extra things, and that's going to, of course, grow over time. So a little CCOT for you there. The Supreme Court enables the federal government to grow over time. One more final one is Gibbons v. Ogden. This is the one that, remember, establishes interstate commerce and the authority of the United States Congress and the federal government to be able to oversee interstate commerce. That's kind of a big deal, especially when it comes to, well, all the internal improvements and economic stuff we'll talk about in just a second. So, awesome. So the Supreme Court becomes a large thing during this time, but there's also some interesting internal foreign policy. I'm a little bit confused. Internal means inside of, foreign means outside of. This is kind of confusing. Well, remember that the United States, as we think of it today, does not exist back in 1800 or 1803, right? There is the Louisiana Purchase. That involves Lewis and Clark. That involves exploring. That involves buying the land from Napoleon, although kind of wasn't legal, right? Initially just trying to get access to the port of New Orleans, but Napoleon needs money. Haitian Revolution is happening and all that kind of stuff. But the Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the United States, and so it is foreign policy, but then it becomes a part of the United States. Plus, there's plenty of stuff talking about Native Americans on this land, so we'll get to that in just a second. Another really important piece of geography you have to know for period 4 is the Missouri Compromise and all the other compromises as we go further and further west. We're going to talk about all the all the westward expansion next time in Unit 5. I like to have Unit 5 kind of be a lot of the controversies as we move west that relate to slavery. But remember, the Missouri Compromise, a lot of the Founding Fathers are still alive at this point. In fact, Jefferson even famously calls this a fire bell in the night. Think blaring alarm. Like, slavery's going to be a problem. I mean, as you can see right here, right, the Missouri Compromise says, okay, we're going to have slaves allowed below this line, as well as Missouri itself, but everything else in the Louisiana Territory is going to be free. We had already had the Northwest Ordinance that established, okay, it makes sense that there's not a lot of labor-intensive cash crops happening, and so therefore North would be free. That kind of makes sense. Down south, more room for growing cotton and stuff like that. But remember, the U.S. does not yet control the areas in orange, so there's not really too much of an issue. It looks like the North kind of gets a little bit of a good deal, and they admit Maine at the same time to keep that balance in the Senate. Yeah, absolutely. But just remember, as we move west, the number one thing to note is as we move west, we get more and more conflicts over slavery, harder and harder to compromise. There's also this thing called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. That's the idea that says, hey, Europe, enough colonizing in the Americas. The Western Hemisphere is our domain. Now, Europe kind of goes, seriously? This is like imagine a third grader kind of standing up in the middle of a high school cafeteria and being like, this is my table, nobody mess. And then everyone's like, we weren't going to, but maybe. So it mostly turns out that European powers are going to be competing against each other, and they don't want anyone else to get too powerful, so they end up kind of being okay with it. But the United States is not yet strong enough to actually enforce this until a little bit later. We're also going to see, unfortunately, the Indian Removal Act. Remember, that occurs under Jackson. And this is going to be where a lot of the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes are removed from the American Southeast into the Oklahoma territories. And yeah, this is incredibly sad. This involves the Trail of Tears, right? We're talking hundreds and thousands of Cherokee that die or get sick or are injured along the way in the middle of winter. It's pretty terrible. By the way, fun fact that's not so fun fact, like, this is how messed up racism is in American history, right? The white European settlers were like, well, these Native Americans don't deserve to be here because they are not civilized enough. They don't act like us. And yet these 5 tribes were considered the 5 civilized tribes because they had adopted all the white man's customs. They were so assimilated in that sense that they had a written language they came up with. They were settled farmers. They had built towns. They even owned African slaves, which, could you get any more emulating the bad parts, trying to be like the European settlers, than owning black slaves? Oh boy. So this happens during Jackson's administration. Remember, Jackson famously says, even though the Supreme Court says you can't do this, they have a right to their land, he says, well, John Marshall's made his decision, let him enforce it. And so it turns out that Jackson was not a big fan of the Indians. Who would have known? It turns out everyone knew, because he had fought the Indians for a long time and he was rabidly racist against them. So there we go. The Trail of Tears, quite a sad part. Speaking of things like sectionalism, we got this good-looking young man. I had the opportunity to visit his estate a few years ago. Quite interesting. It's in Kentucky, and that might give you a little bit of hint as to who it is. But a lot of sectionalism is going to emerge during this time, particularly between the North and the South. There's going to be disagreements on all sorts of stuff. Obviously, the most readily available answer to you is going to be slavery, right? Think Missouri Compromise, think the end of the external slave trade, etc. And Dan, nice work. It is indeed Henry Clay. Yes, the patron saint of APUSH, as they say. The man who runs for president so many times and never gets there, which is really sad. So nice job. This is Henry Clay. Let's mold him then into the shape of the man that he's going to be later on by talking about some of his major things. Notice the joke that I made, Henry Clay, right? Mold. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Moving on. Dad jokes aplenty from this dad here. So, sectionalism in the early republic. What does this involve? Well, it's going to involve things like the tariff and American system. Generally speaking, the North is going to like tariffs that help protect the early American industries. The South is not going to, since they want to import more goods. They're going to argue about that. The American system. The American system is going to be Henry Clay's plan for internal improvements. Think canals, think boats, think tariffs. And he wants this to be able to improve the American economy, but a lot of other people, such as, well, South Carolina John C. Calhoun, etc., are not going to like this too much. Slavery is obviously a really big sectional issue. We'll talk about it a little bit. We mentioned the Missouri Compromise, right? There's going to be abolitionism on the rise during this time, and African Americans who fight against this. Remember, of course, African Americans are resisting the entire time. This is the time of, like, Nat Turner's Rebellion. We're going to see Denmark Vesey and a whole bunch of other kinds of resistance in smaller ways as well. There's also going to be a bunch of movement to the South and the Black Belt. If you're interested Edward Baptiste's The Half Has Never Been Told. Ooh, fantastic book. Basically argues the United States industrialized on the backs of black laborers in the cotton fields, and a lot of that was accomplished through torture as it gets increasingly efficient during this time. Horrifying stories, but really well written and an important book. Highly recommend that. So the South is literally exporting their own internal slave trade from the Carolinas and Virginia down to the Black Belt that is Mississippi and Alabama, where the soil is a bit more fertile and where they have not used it up by generations of tobacco farming, etc. Yeah. We're also going to see, we talked about Nat Turner and slave rebellions, but then finally the market revolution. This is a big deal. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in just a little bit. But remember, the market revolution connects the Northeast to the Midwest, right? So this is going to be connecting New England with the Northwest Territories. Think more like Ohio, getting closer to Michigan. Hey-oh, that's me. And other places. They get more connected with the Old North. Think the New England colonies. And they're starting to leave out the South. The South does not do as many internal improvements. Partly it's a political thing. The Democrats there not so hot on internal improvements. Partly it's they have some navigable rivers. And partly it's just they don't put as much emphasis on infrastructure. So, man, this is going to lead to some sectional tensions because the South kind of gets literally disconnected from the rest of the country, right? All right, so we'll get to more internal improvements, more market revolution, American system stuff in just a second. Let's talk about Jackson and democracy. There is a handy acronym that you can write down to remember the 5 big things you need to know with Andrew Jackson. And these are the 5 letters that we use. Yes, one could substitute a different letter at the beginning, but that would make it naughty, so we're not going to do that. So we're going to say which. First one, war on bank. Remember, Jackson does not like the second bank of the United States. He ends up killing it. He's opposed to it for a variety of reasons. One, he doesn't like remember the rap from last time when Jefferson's like, we create, you just want to move our money around, right? There's a sense in early America that the banks just benefit the rich people that somehow move money around and somehow make money out of money. That doesn't make any sense. I plant stuff in the ground. In Virginia, we plant seeds in the ground. We create. You just want to move our money around, right? Jackson comes from that sort of breed of Jeffersonian people that say, look, everybody should be a farmer, and I don't really trust this whole banking thing. Plus, the banks were lending out way too much money. They led to collapses. They were lending out banknotes like it was no tomorrow. There was no nationalized currency, so we had problems with inflation, problems with bank collapsing, etc. There's going to be the Indian removal. We just talked about that. The 5 civilized tribes, the Indian Removal Act, Worcester v. Georgia, Cherokee Nation, and yeah, not good with Jackson. T, the Tariff of Abominations. Remember, Jackson is actually kind of a compromise guy, and the big thing you need to know about the Tariff of Abominations is that South Carolina threatens to secede over a tariff they don't like, and Jackson says, nope, the Union comes first, and threatens to hang John C. Calhoun or anybody else who resists, and they eventually back down. So Jackson, even though he's a Southerner, even though he's a slave owner, even though he's a Democrat, he does like the idea of Union and does not want to be mistreated because of that. C stands for common man. Remember, during this time we have universal white manhood suffrage, and in sort of a really weird turn of events, African Americans up north and women start to actually lose the franchise or the vote during this time period, but more and more men are able to vote as the property restrictions for voting are taken away or reduced very, very much. So universal white manhood suffrage comes about even as some women and African Americans lose the right to vote up north. And then lastly is the H for hires friends. This is the spoils system, otherwise known as patronage. Here's a lovely illustration to talk about this, right? He's riding on top of a pig. To the victor belong the spoils, Andrew Jackson. And you may have heard of extra spending called pork sometimes. Excuse me, there you go. We got some Andrew Jackson hires friends, a.k.a. I won, so now I get to appoint all my friends who helped me win to all kinds of places in the government, even if they're not necessarily the most qualified. Ah, yes. All right. Now, before we get into stuff a little bit more, we're going to delve into the second party system, and I want to show you this, and I know when I show people this often, the first reaction is, oh my goodness, what am I looking at? Holy cow, what, too many colors, right? A whole bunch of stuff. Again, don't lose the forest for the trees. Do be aware that the second party system involves a lot of weird third parties all the time. Remember, we had the era of good feelings around the time of James Monroe, then it starts to split, and we get a whole bunch of Democrats, but they're different candidates that stand for different things. John Quincy Adams wins in 1824. That's the so-called corrupt bargain election, right? Andrew Jackson wins. Eventually, by this point, we basically get the pro-Jackson and anti-Jackson parties. The anti-Jackson party calls themselves National Republicans. These people call themselves Democratic Republicans, although increasingly just Democrats, right? And so they become Democrats by that point. And then the National Republicans eventually turn into the Whig Party, which you should be familiar with as we get later and later. Particularly Henry Clay, he's kind of the proto-Whig. So yeah, full poster is available for you if you click on that. It's also on Discord. It's very useful. I like it. But don't get too lost in the fact that, wow, there's a lot of different people and a lot of different movements and parties breaking off here. I would focus on this. The second party system basically involves Democrats versus Whigs. Here are some basic differences. We've talked about a couple of these. Couple things that might be handy for you to know. During this time, we have a lot of immigration. More on that in a little bit. The Democrats say, look, we're okay with immigrants. You can be culturally different. But economically, we should kind of be all the same. Like, we like rural areas. We like farmers, especially yeoman farmers, Y-E-O-M-A-N, as in self-sufficient, on the frontier, kind of Jeffersonian ideals, right? So economically the same, but culturally you can be different. Whigs are the complete opposite. They're okay with a mixed economy. They're okay with some manufacturing, some farming, etc. But they kind of want everyone to be culturally the same. That's why they're going to support the Second Great Awakening and a lot of its antebellum reform movements that are seeking to make people into model Protestant white American citizens, whatever that means, in sort of their mold. So, Democrats, but less tolerant of industry and new financial stuff. The Whigs are going to be much more interested in having everybody be really, really, I wouldn't necessarily say all homogeneous, like all the same, but they certainly want people to be very, very similar when it comes to their culture. But economically, they're allowed to be different. Mixed economy. All right, sounds good. So let's talk about the market revolution. Speaking of that, the market revolution is going to involve a whole bunch of inventions. There are a couple right there. If you know what those are, go ahead and drop those into the chat. I know we're a little bit delayed, but I think we can. What are these? When it comes to the market revolution, there is some controversy as to what it's actually called. Is it the market revolution, as in like now we're selling things to an external market to a whole bunch of other people, or is it more a communications and transportation revolution? That's what Daniel Walker Howe argues in his book, What Hath God Wrought. He says, no, it's more about like communication and transportation. Well, okay, that's fine. But yeah, we got ourselves a steamboat. Nice job, Vikram. Nice job. We got a telegraph. Elia, nice job. It looks like we're getting this correct. Okay, good. Yes. So we have a whole bunch of inventions that we can talk about. One of the earliest is going to be the cotton gin in 1793. Eli Whitney. Remember, this is one of the key reasons why slavery expands, even though a lot of the founding fathers thought it was going away. We got the Erie Canal. There are other canals as well, but the Erie Canal is the most famous of those. Yeah, then we get Robert Fulton and the steam engine. We're going to get interchangeable parts, also by Eli Whitney, cotton gin guy. We're going to get the telegraph. Now, let me just pause here and say, look, obviously these inventions are useful in and of themselves, but remember, they're also going to lead to all sorts of different cultural changes. For example, as you begin to produce more and more for the market, women are going to work more and more outside the home. The invention of the cotton gin leads to like Lowell mills and things like that, and that's going to lead to more women and young girls working outside the home, earning their keep or earning their own wages, perhaps even for the first time outside the home. The telegraph is going to lead to the speedy transition and the speedy communication between parties, not only for trade, but also for, think about newspapers becoming a thing, right? The penny press. Same thing with Lowell mills becoming a thing. The steel plow, the McCormick reaper are going to produce more food, which is going to enable the population to grow, which leads to urbanization in some ways. But one of the biggest changes is that political parties are connected to this, as are antebellum reform movements, right? You can't coordinate a whole political party nationwide unless you have fast transportation and fast communication that can coordinate things together. It's harder to have an entire market economy if by the time you ship all of your cotton bales to New York, the price has fallen and it's not even worth it to ship there anymore, right? Markets thrive on stability and information, and all of these things are going to provide stability and information in ways that are very helpful to the American consumer as well as to the American producer. So that's a lot about the inventions, and as we mentioned, transportation and communication are some of the really, really big ones that I would be familiar with. Alrighty. Then, let's talk about the social impact of the market revolution in a bit more depth. Remember, we have King Cotton becoming nationwide. That's a term you should be slightly familiar with. Maybe you don't necessarily memorize it, but remember, cotton is all over the place. You cannot underestimate the impact of cotton. Remember, it's not just the South that's thriving based on slavery. The North is thriving based on slavery. This is a national sin, right, as they call it. It stains everything. And so, keep in mind, up north, they're going to be buying Southern cotton. That's where the Lowell mills get their cotton, right? Northern banks are going to sell and buy cotton. Northern banks are even going to sell and buy slave insurance. And then they're going to make the slave cloth that they clothe the slaves with, right? So, yeah. And Tabitha, I like that. You're like, maybe if I make producing cotton much easier, the cotton industry won't need slaves. Turns out, nope, they'll just make more cotton and have more slaves. And this just does not work out. But, Eli Whitney tried. Definitely did the opposite. So, when it comes to the King Cotton, it's going to spread. That's a picture that I took when I went down south of a large cotton field. You get an idea of how that works. We're also going to see the rise of immigrants during this time. New immigrants for this time are going to be from Ireland and from Germany. And remember, there's going to be a bit of a pushback to that. Pushback to immigration is known as nativism. And there's going to be this Know-Nothing / American Party. As you can see there's the Know-Nothing ticket. And they're going to be voting for them and remember, it's a secret society. That's why the whole, I know nothing about this. So the Know Nothing Party, the American Party, is a nativist party. Connections to the 1920s, if perhaps you're there in the class. I don't know. And then we're going to see things like urbanization. We already talked about that. New roles for women working in factories. And there's also this thing called the cult of domesticity. This is the idea that women should stay home. They should be able to take care of the children. And it's sort of a replacement of American motherhood. It's kind of this weird ideal of let's keep the women because they're fragile. Let's keep them at home and not expose them to the horrors of the market economy and stuff like that. So, new roles for women, but also kind of the same. Notice some continuity and change here, right? Continuity is that women are still subjected to a lot of this patriarchy stuff, but you can also see a lot of change because they're receiving some new places to work. Speaking of new ideas and new roles for women, let's talk about the Second Great Awakening and antebellum reforms. So, we had the First Great Awakening that was before the American Revolution, and that led to the American Revolution through a variety of ways. But the Second Great Awakening is going to happen in the 1800s. It starts in upstate New York. There's going to be a whole bunch of religious revivals sweeping upstate New York, the so-called burned over district sweeping up and down the Erie Canal. Oh, man. And it's going to be talking about two things, personal perfection and societal change. Part of it's hey, if we can change enough hearts, we can change society. A lot of it has to do with millenarianism, the idea that millennialism, sometimes called the idea that if Americans can make themselves and their country perfect, then Jesus will come back sooner. Interesting Christian theology there. So there's going to be some new Protestant sects. Think Methodists and Baptists as opposed to the old-fashioned Puritans, Congregationalists, that kind of stuff. We're also going to see people like the Mormons coming about, romantics, transcendentalists. There's going to be utopian societies, lots of that kind of religious fervor going around. Women's rights are going to be a thing during this time. Some of you recognize, yes, my lady Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we absolutely do stand, thank you very much. Women's rights at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which is when this period ends, and that's actually why, because that's kind of a nice endpoint for us here with the antebellum reform movements, so they're fighting for women's rights. We're going to see other things like abolitionism, of course, talking about more of that in period 5, unit 5, because of the whole slavery, Civil War thing. We're also going to see temperance. Remember, drink less alcohol. Education. Remember, this is actually connected to a lot of the Whiggish stuff. So let's use education to make people into better American citizens. But also, even though they're public schools, let's make them into good Protestant Christians who are good citizens. So there's some shaping, let's say, there. And we're also going to see things like Dorothea Dixon, prison and mental health reform during this time. Alrighty. So, we've reached the end of Unit 4 with most of our discussions. I'm going to quick check the Q&A along the way. It doesn't look like we have any questions yet, which is totally fine. Totally fine. Excuse me. We just covered a whole bunch of topics related to Period 4. That's great. And yes, one last thing. I'm glad that we're talking about this in the chat. Like, mental health is super important, y'all. You know what I'm talking about? Like, you need to be able to take care of yourself before you can do well on any of this. So even as you're studying, be thinking about that mental health. Absolutely. All right. So we just covered a bunch of stuff. Let's do some practice questions. Yeah, we're not done yet, Dan. What are you talking about? We're not even done. Let's get into this. We got some practice questions. Here we go. We're looking at an Erie Canal lock operations at Lockport, New York. Whoa, I wonder where they got that name from. In 1839. Here we go. Some practice questions. So there's a quick zooming in. Here's our first question. And I'm going to put this into a question so that way we can actually make this into a poll. I'll open it up. I'll show it right here. Internal improvements like the one pictured above would be most likely be supported by which of the following groups in the 1830s? We got Whigs, we got Jacksonian Democrats, we got Federalists, we got Republicans. We got options A, B, C, or D. Although if I show this, it cuts off part D, so I want to make sure that that's not hidden from you. So internal improvements in 1839 supported by Whigs, Jacksonian Democrats, Federalists, or Republicans. You should be able to see this below the video, I believe, if you scroll down. But yeah, I am glad that we were able to finish the content a little bit earlier. We got a little carried away with period 3, thanks to some wrapping that may or may not have happened. By the way, if you watched period 3, yeah, we don't necessarily need some feedback on the wrapping skills, but part of the earlier part was frozen because something was happening with Vimeo, but it works out more toward the middle. So skip ahead with that and, watch the period 3 at some point, see the wrapping that happens, and get, some review in as well. All right, here we go. The poll is closing. It looks like most of us are saying most of us said letter A, but it was rather evenly split. Let's see. What was the answer? The answer was... Oh, sorry. Before I talk about the answer, I forgot to put this in there. Do we need to use the stimulus in this question? This is one of those where it's like, not really, but it does help, because if you forgot what internal improvements were, you could be like, oh yeah, canals. That might be helpful. So you don't have to, but it's maybe useful. The answer is going to be letter A, the Whigs. Remember, the Whigs are Henry Clay type people, and they're going to be all about the American system, about internal improvements, and yes, much more interested in this kind of stuff, especially since they're up north. Not all of them are, but more of them are going to be up north. Jacksonian Democrats, not quite as interested in internal improvements. And then Federalists, this is too late for Federalists, and it's too early for Republicans. Ah, there you go. Question number 2. Infrastructure improvements like the one pictured above changed the economy in all the following ways, except, make sure we see that word except there. And I'll open up our next poll. Here we go. What do we got? Is it A, increased economic ties to other countries? B, linked the North and South more closely than the North and Midwest? C, increased the efficiency of the transportation of market goods? D, led to more production for the market rather than semi-subsistence, aka just making enough for your family? Which of those is not an effect of infrastructure improvements related to the economy? Give us a few more seconds to think about that. Again, with this one, did you have to use the stimulus, aka the source, in this case, a picture that accompanies these questions? I don't think you had to, but it couldn't hurt, especially if you don't remember what infrastructure is. And yeah, it's not a bad way to give yourself a little bit of extra help. This is where, again, frequently the stimulus is not going to mislead you, but sometimes it's absolutely necessary, and sometimes it's just useful in the sense of it reminds you of some history. But if you know your history, you could also answer this quite cold. All right, let's see what we got here. We said mostly letter B, although there was a strong showing for letter A, and not much love for letter C or D, which is probably pretty good, because the answer is going to be B. It does not link the North and the South more closely than the North and the Midwest, as we just covered a few seconds ago. Remember, the North and the Midwest are going to have most of the infrastructure, and they're going to be the most connected. Therefore, there's going to be some increasing sectional tensions because the North and the South are not nearly as connected as the North and the Midwest. Oh boy. All right. I got one more for you. Another practice multiple choice. I should probably explain the acronym there. SBMCQ, a stimulus-based multiple choice question. This one has a stimulus. I don't think the stimulus is normally going to confuse you, but there might be occasional times. So I would read it carefully. I wouldn't skip it ever. But remember, you can certainly use your history knowledge to be able to guide you as you talk. So here we go. Andrew Jackson, message 1832. Okay, he's president. He's giving a message. When the laws undertake to make the rich richer, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers have a right to complain of the injustices of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. If it would confine itself to equal protection of the rich and poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. It seems like Andrew Jackson doesn't like the act before him, because it's going to increase the gap between the rich and the poor. Interesting. Well, let's think about this one. Do we need the stimulus with this question? Do we need to read the quote with this question? It says, groups that would most likely agree with the sentiment expressed in the excerpt above would most likely also support which of the following? I can't really tell you the sentiments expressed in the excerpt unless I know what the excerpt says and I actually read it, right? So I'm going to say we do need to read the stimulus on this one, although if you really know your Jackson, you could probably just go, oh, it's Andrew Jackson, now I know. So who would also agree with Andrew Jackson? Probably Democrats. What else would Democrats be interested in supporting? We got ourselves another poll. Let me open this up for you. What do you think? Again, most likely, but history is also needed, and history can be very, very helpful. So let's move back here. What do you think? What about this question? We got increased tariffs, antebellum reform movements, the expansion of slavery, or internal improvements. Groups who would agree with Andrew Jackson. By the way, this is his bank veto message. Ooh, tricksy. Groups who would also agree that they were against the Bank of the United States would also agree with which of the following and support which of the following. Ooh, it's neck and neck right now. We have it tied. Still tied. The right answer is in the lead, but it's tied. Give us a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to close it now because it has the lead. Here we go. Looks like yes, the answer was C. Nice job. The answer was C. Why is it the expansion of slavery? Well, remember, Democrats tend to be from the South. They tend to like the expansion of slavery. That leads to the expansion of farming. That leads to the kind of Jeffersonian farmer's paradise they like. Plus, they're more okay with slavery than some of the Whigs are, who have a little bit of problems with their conscience. And so Andrew Jackson says, I'm against the bank. Democrats are against the bank. And therefore, they're also going to be for the expansion of slavery. Kind of requires a couple different movements, right? A couple different brain leaps there. So that one was not easy. So nice job. Thank you for wrestling with that one. Let's go a little bit into a modified document-based question, a DBQ, a document-based question. Modified in the sense that I'm not giving you 7 documents, right? I'm just going to kind of give us a couple and get us a couple ideas as to how we could potentially move forward with this kind of a prompt. So, document analysis, we've talked about this before, but document analysis, you might use Happy or Chappy or all kinds of other things. We're going to use Hippo just because that's one option. Remember, the first 4 are what are intended to be document analyses. You have to do that for 3 documents somewhere in your essay. We'll get into this much more in depth when we talk about the FRQs in a few weeks. And then outside evidence, you got to have a couple of these throughout your essay. So use the document, to be able to brainstorm some outside evidence that could potentially be useful. Remember, historical context. Talk about, hey, what's going on at this time period? Why is it useful? What does it help us describe? I, intended audience. Who is he talking to? Why might this be useful? P for point of view, what's his perspective on the events happening, and then the purpose of the author in writing the document. I always suggest that you have to have these three together, because if you're saying he's writing to Democrats, that's not really that helpful. If you say he's writing to Democrats to convince them that they should also be against the bank, well, now you've said something useful, right? So there we go. Hippo. Let's get into it, and you probably will recognize this particular source because we just looked at it. This is the full bank veto message. No, wait, not even close. I'm just kidding. It's super long. It's just a little bit longer, and I gave you a couple of dots there to cut it down a bit. He obviously makes a big, long speech about this. But Andrew Jackson, he's the president. He's making a statement about the bank, and notice the prompt, which I forgot to read earlier, my apologies, and that would be evaluate the extent to which Americans argued about the role of the federal government between 1800 and 1850. I could think of lots of stuff that might be useful for us to talk about with the role of the federal government, not the least of which would be the Revolution of 1800, Thomas Jefferson, maybe Louisiana Purchase, the whole Supreme Court, John Marshall stuff, but now we're talking about Andrew Jackson and whether or not the federal government can have a bank. All right. So if we think about the HIP analysis, we could talk about its historical context is the second bank of the United States. There's debate over the American system, internal improvements. Andrew Jackson is sending this message to Congress because he wants to tell them, I think this is unconstitutional. He's also sending a message, because this is public, right? He's sending a message to his Democratic supporters. His point of view is he does not like banks because he thinks that they cheat farmers and ordinary people. Absolutely. And then the purpose of this, well, we just kind of talked about that. It's to show people what he's all about. So that would be one sort of option. In 1835, we had a speech by Thaddeus Stevens. You might remember him from Reconstruction as you studied in Period 5. But for now, he's talking about something else. He says, if then education be of admitted importance to the people under all forms of governments, and of unquestioned necessity when they govern themselves, it follows, of course, that its cultivation and diffusion is a matter of public concern, and a duty which every government owes to its people. AKA, this dude really likes public education. Many complain of the school tax, not so much on account of its amount, as because it is for the benefit of others and not themselves. This is a mistake. It is for their benefit inasmuch as it perpetuates the government. Sounds like he's saying, look, I like to fund public education because I want to be surrounded by intelligent, informed citizens. Sounds like what John Green said once, and of course Thomas Jefferson makes comments about this, right? An informed and literate and educated citizenry is necessary for the functioning of a republic. Nice job. I would agree. I think public education is very important in this country. Even if I'm not benefiting from it right now, I like to be surrounded by people that are informed and educated, and it makes the country better. That's what he's saying. So, historical context? Well, we could talk about, this sounds like an educational reform sort of thing, like an antebellum reform, support of public education, think Horace Mann, etc. Ooh, that might be some outside evidence, another example. Sounds great. We could talk about his intended audience. It sounds like he's giving a speech. Maybe it's to Congress, but it more sounds like he's trying to drum up support for public education amongst ordinary American citizens. His point of view, his purpose, he's trying to convince people to agree with him that he likes public education and thinks it's worth it. There we go. So, questions, concerns that we have at this point. Let me recheck in with the questions and answers we've had so far. Okay. Yeah, so it looks like Alexis is asking for another performance. Unfortunately, we're not going to get another Hamilton rap right now. Maybe we can do one a little bit later. That would be nice. But thanks for the vote of confidence there. KL was asking, hey, can we go over the tariff of abominations again? Yeah, so I don't want to get into this too much because I feel like it might be useful if you're taking an econ class, but you don't want to get too lost in this. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. South Carolina and John C. Calhoun and a lot of the Democrats did not like tariffs, but Andrew Jackson was kind of like meh on tariffs, but it was a tariff that was passed by the federal government. It was the law, and Andrew Jackson was going to enforce it. John C. Calhoun and some South Carolinians threatened to secede, that is, leave the country over this issue, and Andrew Jackson says, nuh-uh, not on my watch, you're going to stay in the country. So, big picture here, the South continues to disagree over economic policy, and it's partly related to slavery, of course, with the whole, what they import, etc. And Andrew Jackson is more like, hey, I sympathize with some of your Southern stuff, but we got to keep the country together. The Union It must be preserved, as he once famously said in a toast. Let's see. Connor was saying, hey, can we explain the Whigs again? Remember, the Whigs are the other political party other than the Democrats. During this time, let's think after the era of good feelings, so 1830s, 40s, 50s, until they fall apart. More on that next week. And the Whigs are going to be the anti-Jackson party initially, then they kind of coalesce, gather around Henry Clay. They're in favor of things like the American system. They like antebellum reforms. They're not so hot on immigrants unless they assimilate and become good Protestant Christian American citizens, just like them. They are a national party, but they tend to be concentrated in the North and the Midwest. This kind of makes sense, right? They're more for internal improvements, less for the expansion of slavery. All right. Great question. Alexis kind of asked an overall question. Like, what do you think is the central, few things overall we should be knowing about the period? Well, Alexis, this is why I started off with a slide that had kind of the overarching big three things. I mean, for this period, I'd say, look, we got the expansion of democracy in a variety of ways, whether that's more people voting or the Second Great Awakening, antebellum reform movements. We're going to have arguments between political parties, as well as people moving all over the place. That means immigration. That means westward migration. So governmental arguments. We're going to talk about the expansion of democracy. We're going to talk about, and then also the market revolution would be a really, really big one as well. So the economy's changing, culture and politics are changing, and throughout the whole thing, we got a bunch of different presidents you should be somewhat familiar with. Yeah, nice job. Let's see. If we are interested in looking at the antebellum reform movements, look at back a few slides and just talk about a couple of those. You don't have to know them all, but I'd be familiar with a couple of them. There's a whole slide with a whole bunch of them. Remember, it comes out of the Second Great Awakening. If we can improve ourselves, we can also improve society as a whole. Let's see. Can we talk about the American system and the Whig Party? Remember, the Whig Party is in favor of internal improvements, and that means things like infrastructure, canals, roads, bridges, etc., and telegraph wires, things like that. And the Whig Party is all in favor of that. They like a more mixed economy, so let's have banking, let's have manufacturing. And the American system involves tariffs to protect the manufacturing, because obviously if you put tariffs on imported goods, that makes domestic goods cheaper, which helps out our early industries. The American system is also going to involve internal improvements, like we said, tariffs, and then maybe some this is maybe some Henry Clay stuff, but it's also a little bit bigger than Henry Clay, so it is the Whig Party, as you said. Let's see, Les was talking about Lowell Mills. Remember Lowell Mills, those are textile mills up in New England, and they're going to be using southern cotton to produce textiles. The reason we care about it is because, one, it's related to southern cotton, two, it's a part of the market revolution, and three, it involves often young girls who are going to be working there, usually after they're like 15, 16, up until they get married. So it's a little bit of pseudo-independence for them, but also they start to form unions, so there's some pushback, so we start to see early industrialization, and things we'll cover a bit more in period 6. Let's see, someone asked about the differences between Whigs and Democrats. Again, we have a whole slide on this, and I feel like we talked about it, so I want to get to some other stuff, but that's a great question. Keep going about that. And then Yuki asked, let's talk about the details of the LEQ and DBQ. They terrify me. Don't worry, we got you covered. We got some FRQ dedicated crams coming up after we finish the content review. In the meantime, we got practice questions every week. We're going to hit more of the DBQ and the LEQ even next week, so that should be good. That should be good. All right, those are most of the questions that I'm seeing big picture for now. Let's just be able to finish up a couple of these things with a couple tips for studying and next steps. So a reminder, just like you hear people say, you can't compare them, it's like this. Well, I think you should. They're both fruit. They both have an external shell that you shouldn't necessarily eat as much as the inside. Wait, with apples you do eat the outside shell. But I remember back in the day, we used to peel my apples. My mom used to do that for me. That was... I'm getting distracted. Yes. Use historical thinking skills such as compare and contrast, right? So you want to be able to talk about oranges and apples, yeah, but talking historically. I'll give you a couple examples there. So, contextualization, compare, contrast, causation, change in continuity over time. Keep thinking about that. I'll give you a couple of options for examples to think about. Remember, active recall is a big deal. Quiz yourself. Don't just reread your notes mindlessly. Quiz yourself. The harder your brain works, the more you can actually remember it later. Those of you taking AP Psych know all about this. Fantastic. And also, watch 5-0. I mean, we're here for you, right? So, We're back here next week, and we're covering period 5. It should be a blast, and we'll get more into the FRQs, or free response questions, aka writing. Yes. Yeah, we call the FRQs on this exam the DBQ and the LEQ, so nice job. Let me give you some examples of historical thinking skills just to go forward. We'll talk about this more when we talk about hacking the exam, but man, if you can compare and contrast the Whigs and the Democrats, that sounds like a really great way to talk about it. What do they have in common? What's different? You could talk about causation with the market revolution, right? The invention of the cotton gin kind of is one of those things that causes the market revolution, but also the market revolution causes the Seneca Falls Convention. How does that work? Well, remember, it's hard to coordinate a national campaign unless you have the ability to talk to each other really well. So the women's rights movement is going to communicate via the telegraph, be able to move around thanks to a lot of the market revolution's communication and transportation techniques. But you have other options. You have other things that can cause or come from the market revolution. Awesome. You could also talk about CCOT, change and continuity over time. Here's an example, westward expansion and slavery. I'm looking at this timeline, obviously not to scale, because otherwise, woof, that's not good. 1787, that's the Constitution. Now I'm thinking about things like the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Northwest Ordinance. 1803, Louisiana Purchase. 1808, end of the international slave trade. 1820, Missouri Compromise. 1833, Nat Turner's Rebellion. 1844, election of Polk. 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War. We'll talk about that next time. My point here is this. You got all these events related to slavery. Well, how could we talk about CCOT? Well, it seems to me that the events get more and more violent, the compromises get less and less likely, and yet the continuity is slaves are resisting, and there are abolitionists. Maybe they're Quakers initially, but yeah, there are more and more people there who are resisting slavery. There's a sectional tension between the North and the South that's consistent throughout this whole time period. Think about those sorts of things. Absolutely. Just to give you a couple of additional practice things you could think about with historical thinking skills, just to give you some options here. So you could compare and contrast the North and the South during this time, maybe the economy, maybe you could compare and contrast Whigs and Democrats. Causation and effects, right? Causes and effects. What's the market revolution? What causes the Second Great Awakening? What causes the antebellum reform movements? What causes the War of 1812? What comes from that? Those would be some good questions to ask yourself. And then CCOT, what happens to democracy? It turns out that more and more people could vote. Universal white manhood suffrage. And yet African Americans and women still can't vote. Okay, that makes sense. Political rights. There's an expansion of political rights, but there's also the idea that there's still a lot of white men who are in charge. Slavery is still a big issue this entire time. That's a continuity. The American economy begins to change, and yet there's still this emphasis on labor-intensive cash crops and slavery. We have options, and then migration patterns, of course, moving west. But man, there we go. We got some options. Specifically for Unit 4, a reminder that you want to talk about start and end dates, 1800 to 1848. If we're talking about how we can make sure that we don't get lost too much, 1800 is Thomas Jefferson, all the way to antebellum reform movements at the end to the Seneca Falls Convention. So don't lose the forest for the trees, as I've said before. Keep in mind those big topics we already went over. Keep in mind some of those themes, like culture, politics, the economy. Those are really, really big during this time period. And then we should be all set. All right, we are almost to 10 o'clock. So if we can get to some last questions, that might not be a bad idea. As you're putting in some questions and I'm answering them, don't forget we got trivia coming up. Oh, man, get hyped for that. That's happening tomorrow at 10 p.m. Unit 4 trivia, a.k.a. you can totally own the trivia because you were here with this live stream. That's awesome. And remember that we have this conversation going on the Fiveable forums. It's going on Discord right after this, led by our very own Tomasito. Whoop, whoop. Here we go. It's going to be great. So keep those things in mind as you plan out the rest of your APUSH studying. I'm going to take a look at some of our Q&A stuff. Let's see. What was the... Yeah. So, was the market revolution good or bad for the common man? Was it exploitative? Yeah, great question. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? Much like with most things, it's going to be, useful because they can sell more things to more people, yet at the same time, it's forcing them to produce for other people rather than for themselves. They have fewer options, over what they can produce, less ability to make their own decisions. Yeah, I think for women as well, it's going to be a mixed bag, right? They're starting to work outside the home, which can be useful, but the conditions aren't so great, but they're making some money. So lots of different options there. And then couple of other ones. Let's see. Somebody was asking about sheets that we could get. I believe, Thomasina, we do have an APUSH Cram sheet. If we could make sure we share that in the Discord, go ahead and check on there. She can link to that at some point. Documents with key terms, ideas, things like that. Yep, that'd be great. A good Cram sheet. Sounds good. All right. Well, folks, you have been fantastic. Don't forget about trivia tomorrow, the Fiveable Forum going on in Discord right now. And hey, you've got this. Remember, we talked about mental health today with the antebellum reform movements, but also you take care of your mental health, right? Do something fun, take a load off, relax a little bit. You got this. We're in it together. We're here with you and for you to the very end. So let's do this. It's called Fiveable, which means we can all get a 5 together. So thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you had a great time. You remembered some stuff. You reviewed some stuff. Continue on with Discord, and we'll